Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Global Agenda at the University of Delaware. I'm Ralph Begleiter, Director of the Center for Political Communication. I'm always glad to note that Global Agenda is supported by the University of Delaware's Institute for Global Studies, the Department of Political Science and International Relations, and the Department of Communication. We live in a digital world. Just look around you at the people sitting at the next table at the restaurant, texting their friends instead of talking with the ones right at their own table. Or try to do your taxes without a computer. And as we heard from former National Security Agency Director Michael Hayden just last week, spies and sneaky guys are all using digital weapons, both in offense and defense. Despite all that, the popularity of John le Carré's Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy demonstrates that we still like an old-fashioned spy story. And it's still true that the world of espionage relies very heavily on people to do the most sensitive and skilled work in intelligence. Whether it's peering through a magnifier at satellite images of bin Laden's hideaway in Pakistan last year, or meeting secretly with some of his henchmen in Egypt, Yemen, or Afghanistan. Human intelligence, the kind of espionage produced by people who betray their governments in Syria or Iran or China or Russia, is still among the most valuable information reaching the President of the United States every morning in the President's daily brief. Our guest tonight is Robert Grenier. He has spent 3 decades working for the CIA in the National Clandestine Service. Much of that time, he worked specifically in human intelligence, undercover, overseas, which means others didn't know what he was up to. Among Bob Grenier's assignments, the CIA's Counter-Terrorism Center, where he focused, after the 9/11 attacks, on preventing another big one. As the CIA's station chief in Pakistan, Grenier directed operations against the Taliban before and after the 9/11 attacks. He was the CIA's representative to the White House during the Bush administration's invasion of Iraq in 2003. Earlier in his career, he was chief of the CIA's basic spy training ground, known as the Farm. There, he authored the Clandestine Service's Code of Ethics. Bob Grenier earned his Bachelor of Arts degree in philosophy at Dartmouth and was a graduate student at the University of Virginia. Please welcome Robert Grenier to the University of Delaware.
Thank you, Ralph. You all hear me?
Not very much.
No. It'll come out. Just talk. Can you hear me now? Once again, thank you, Ralph. Very much appreciate your very kind introduction. And it's a great privilege for me to be able to speak to you here at the University of Delaware. But there were a couple of hurdles that I had to overcome before I could actually sign on to come and speak to you all, and one of them, frankly, was the title. Spies, Lies, and Sneaky Guys. It has a certain alliteration, it works, but I still didn't feel terribly comfortable with it. Something about it that suggests that the people who are engaged in this profession are somewhat morally challenged. Am I being too sensitive here? But you know, as I thought about it more, it seems to me that, quite frankly, that's entirely understandable. In fact, what we do in the espionage world is highly questionable morally, certainly for those who are not very well introduced. I mean, think about it. The things that spies are supposed to do, the things that they do on a day-in, day-out basis, are all the things that your parents tell you you're never supposed to do. You're lying, you're cheating, you're stealing, mostly documents, sometimes other things. You're misrepresenting yourself. You're misrepresenting your intentions. You're misleading other human beings. As Ralph just mentioned, I was actually the author of the Code of Ethics for the Clandestine Service. Now, some of you may think that's an oxymoron. Someone's nodding very vigorously over here. Well, just give me a willful suspension of disbelief here for a moment when I tell you that, in fact, people in the clandestine service do take their moral obligations very, very seriously. There are, in fact, codes by which we measure our conduct, by which we guide our conduct for ourselves and our colleagues. But at the base of it all, it really comes down to an aspect of just war theory. I mean, after all, soldiers who are serving their country, they do things that, under normal circumstances, people should never do. They kill people, they break things. And yet, under certain circumstances, we say that this is not only morally permissible, but in some cases actually morally required to defend their country against those who would wantonly kill their fellow citizens. Well, it's the same in a very different context for people who engaged in espionage. You know, a quote that I read many years ago and that stuck with me ever since and has affected my thinking ever since came in some testimony that was given by a former Secretary of State, Dean Rusk. And in response to a question from a senator, he said, "Senator, other nations have interests. The United States has responsibilities. Whether we like it or not, our country is the indispensable nation. Whether we like it or not, we have assumed on our shoulders tremendous responsibilities around the world. And given those responsibilities, there are certain things that we must be willing to do. Certain capabilities that American policymakers, American leaders must have if we are to fulfill those responsibilities." So to the question, and it's not a rhetorical one, to the question, should we be doing this in a digital age or any other age, unsurprisingly, I'm going to tell you yes. As I say, it's not just a rhetorical question. And there's some people who like to engage on this, perhaps in the Q&A. I'd be very happy to do that. I've thought about this a lot. And I'd love to talk about it. But maybe more fundamentally, and more apropos of what it is that we're here to speak about tonight, the question is, can we do this in the digital age? And it's not a frivolous question. The world has changed tremendously. I was telling some of the students a little bit earlier today what it was like when I was operating under non-official cover. I was operating as a business person, unconnected with the U.S. government back in the mid-1980s, and I was traveling around the world, meeting with intelligence assets. Various points during 27 years, I had a lot of different covers. I'm not revealing any national secrets when I say that there were times when I was posing as a diplomat, other times as a civilian member of the Department of the Army. I had other covers as well. But in those years, when I was operating ostensibly as a business person traveling internationally, as I think back on it now, it was unbelievable what we were able to get away with. I had a pocket full of alias documents, another pocket full of cash, and I could go pretty much anywhere I wanted and do pretty much anything I wanted to do. But there was a day, it was the mid-1980s, and I went to check into a hotel, a large, popular hotel in Geneva. I presented my passport at the desk, and the clerk turned around, took something off of a printer, and he placed it on the desk in front of me. Let's just say that I was Mr. Smith that day. And this little form letter said, "Welcome back, Mr. Smith. We're very glad to have you." Nothing particularly surprising about that, is there? Not in today's context. I had been there before. I'd been there a little over a year before. Now, it's not new that hotels then, or since time immemorial maybe, would have records. And so if the inspector of police in Geneva were to have come to that hotel and said, "Please, I wish to see a record concerning a Monsieur Schmidt. I need to know if he has stayed in your hotel on the 25th of January in 1988. Your cooperation would be appreciated. We've seen this movie, right? And so the nervous clerk, sweating bullets, he rushes back and he pulls out the paper records and, oh, yes, sir, yes, sir. Here's a Mr. Schmidt, and he was with us on the 25th of January. He was in room 1219. But when I made the reservation to go and stay in that hotel, I didn't think that they were going to be going over 30-some years of paper records to find out if I'd ever stayed there before. We forget what life was like, and it wasn't that long ago, believe me. But now, when I saw this form letter that said, "Welcome back, Mr. Smith," oh my God. It was like the future in a flash had opened up before my eyes, and I didn't like what I was seeing. Think about it. If this man in this hotel can do that, because all this information is suddenly available to him, well, what if they did that at border crossings? What if they did it at multiple border crossings simultaneously? What if somebody in the immigration department of a particular country that I was traveling through could see the pattern of travel that I had made over a course of years and then correlate it with other things that were happening at the same time? And I wasn't even thinking about machine-readable passports or biometrics. But like a bolt of lightning, suddenly I could see the future, and it did not look good. This was going to be a very bad thing for espionage. I remember also during that time, when I was traveling internationally, particularly if I was traveling through an international gateway where they had fairly serious immigration controls, I would show up at the airport early, and I would go to a newsstand, and I would purchase a newspaper. And I'd go and I'd find a quiet spot, and I'd sit and I'd open up the newspaper and act as though I were reading it. But what I was really doing was going over my story in my head. I'd literally sit there and say, okay, who am I? Who do I represent? What company am I with? What business am I doing? Who am I going to meet? Where did I go to college? What did I major in? What year did I graduate? What's my mother-in-law's maiden name? All those things that I should know automatically if I am who I say I am. But at that time, certainly during the course of an interview, and unless they were so suspicious of me they were going to arrest me for several days so they could launch a full investigation, they weren't going to be able to check on any of this. If I was glib, if I had the answers, if I acted perfectly normal, I was going to get through 99 times out of 100. Even in the unlikely event that they pulled me into a secondary interrogation. Think about the situation now. Some little guy sitting in the back room in a matter of minutes would be able to come back out and say, wait a minute, Bowdoin College, 1976, there was no Smith. Think how many other holes he could have poked in my story, even when I was telling as much of the truth as I possibly could. Think about the fact that I didn't have any credit history in that name. Oh, this is very interesting, Mr. Smith. You have a credit card. According to this credit card, you've never engaged in a single non-cash transaction before 6 months ago. How old are you? You couldn't do it. And what it means is that by and large, there are always exceptions, but by and large, nowadays anymore, you have to be who you say you are. What's an honest spy to do? This is terrible. And it makes life much, much more difficult. That is espionage in the digital age. What that means, therefore, is that the paradigm has had to change. And this has been underway for a long time now, and it's a progression that was still very much underway when I left 6 years ago. And I have no doubt, although they don't tell me anything anymore, I have no doubt that it's still underway now. And it's a difficult thing. If you have to be who you say you are, and you can't do the sorts of things that I did with impunity back in the mid-1980s, that means if we want somebody to be able to pose as a nuclear scientist, she better be a nuclear scientist. You know, back in the good old days of the Cold War, when we were primarily focused on the Russians and the Chinese, communist powers, these were closed societies. There were very few people who were actually able to come out of these societies, and the few people who were able to come out of those societies disproportionately were diplomats and others assigned to embassies abroad. And so people like me typically were posing as diplomats. That was pretty easy. I spent a lot of my career as a State Department officer. And you go to cocktail parties and you try to bump into these people and you try to develop a personal relationship that you hoped would turn into an intelligence relationship. But when you're dealing with terrorism and nuclear proliferation of missiles, narcotics, you have to be able to go places, you have to be able to be things that are very, very difficult to establish and to maintain, particularly if you have to be who you say you are. Think of the effort that would be required to do that. Think at the same time of all the things that we want a staff operations officer. Now, mind you, let's get the nomenclature right here. We don't talk about CIA agents. Agents are the individuals, usually foreign nationals, who have access to information of interest to the U.S. government, and they're the ones who provide that information. They are the sources. We call them agents. Officers, people like what I used to be, we call officers, or in the clandestine service, case officers. Well, think of all the things that we want case officers to be. We want them to be able to write like William F. Buckley. We want them to be able to brief presidents. We want them to be able to do analysis. We want them to know multiple languages. We want them to mature in their craft. We ultimately want them to become managers, ultimately maybe senior managers. Well, if early in their careers, we are taking them as nuclear scientists, and we're saying you have to maintain your capability as a nuclear scientist. You have to be able to do all the things that nuclear scientists do. How do you develop all of these other capabilities? And if you've put millions of dollars and years of effort into establishing that kind of a cover, well, you're going to be very, very careful about the way that you use it. Back when I was Mr. Smith, if I suddenly came under suspicion, Mr. Smith suddenly was no more. Gone. Problem solved. And I'm back 2 weeks later as Mr. Jones in a different place. Not so easy if you have to be who you say you are. So, in a context where, in the clandestine service, it has been an article of faith for many, many years that the problem, the solution to virtually any problem is a well-trained case officer. If that's what it takes to maintain a case officer, to get that individual where that individual needs to be, maybe a case officer, per se, isn't your first choice solution. Talked about agents and case officers. Well, what if you combine the two? What if, instead, you take an individual, let's say somebody who is a cleric, a Muslim cleric from Mogadishu, Somalia. You're not going to find a garden variety case officer who's able to operate in that kind of an environment and get close to the people that you want to get close to. But if you find that person, that genuine person, and you recruit that person to represent you, not as a case officer, but as sort of a hybrid. There's nothing new about this. We used to call them staff agents. Maybe they still do. And there are any number of different permutations on that scenario, but as I say, it's nothing new. Espionage is the second oldest profession in the world. There is nothing new under the sun in espionage. But the paradigms, making what used to be exceptional and making it routine, that's the real challenge. And that's why espionage in the digital age is so difficult. You have to be who you say you are, and it means that we have to develop, not just as a service, but essentially as a country, because there are whole lots of other people who get votes on this, Congress in particular. We have to change that paradigm. So, we've talked about the challenges. Even raised the question as to whether it's possible to do espionage in the digital age. And in fact, it is. Don't worry. It's more difficult, but it can be done. It is being done. It will continue to be done. Oh, and by the way, there's some good news here too. Because at the same time that we are faced with all these challenges in the digital world, there are also some tremendous advantages that arise as well. I was talking about the fact that traditionally in the clandestine service, the answer to every problem is a well-trained case officer. And that, well, maybe that's not exactly true. Maybe we don't need to have a huge number of additional case officers. Maybe what we need to have is a more modest number of officers who are properly supported. Having proper coverage requires a tremendous amount of administrative backroom work. It's not glamorous. It's not the stuff of spy movies, but it's the stuff that makes espionage possible. A well-operating case officer has to have targeting. You know, again, back in the 80s, when I was a young pup, yeah, we were doing targeting, but it was just awful. It was really primitive. Junior officer operating in North Africa. Remember, this is the days of the Cold War. So we were very concerned about leftist organizations that could be used as fronts by the communists. So as a young man in North Africa, it was my job to get close to radical leftist student leaders. Who knew anything about radical leftist student leaders in North Africa? Well, yeah, there was probably some French academic who'd done a fair amount of work, and if you could find some dusty old monograph that he'd written and it might be in a secondhand bookstore in Paris, maybe that would help you, but who knew if it even existed? So what I felt was that the best way to find out about student radical leaders was to spend time with students. Students in North Africa in the 1980s, I guess much like students now, they didn't have a whole lot of money, and so they'd hitchhike everywhere. And so what I'd do is I would go and I would pick up hitchhikers. So I'd pick up some young man, and I would try in the space of about 3 blocks to find out if he knew anything about what was happening in the student movement, and if he didn't, I would make an excuse, give him a pack of cigarettes, kick him out of the car, and go someplace else. And then if he did know something, as he may have 1 time out of 10, then I'd make some excuse to follow up with him. I'd give him another pack of cigarettes. He'd be very glad to come and see me again in a cafe the following week, and we'd go on from there. So, A, for effort, but this was really primitive, and it was difficult, and it was not at all efficient. If you were doing it now, think of the amount of information that you'd have available to you. That dusty monograph, it'd be online. You'd have all this information from Facebook and from Twitter. You'd be able to figure out in pretty short order, without ever setting foot on the street, who it was that you really needed to go after, who had the information that you were looking for, and then you could begin to think productively about how we get close to that individual. That's the difference that targeting has made in the context of espionage in the digital age. We talked about the difficulty of operating as a case officer, the difficulties involved in identifying and recruiting agents. Well, okay, we have an agent. We have that wonderful thing, an agent in place. Now what? Well, We recruited this individual to provide information, so we have to communicate with him. In the old days, that could be a very difficult thing under the circumstances. If you're talking about Moscow in the 1950s, oh my goodness. You could never meet face-to-face with somebody like that. Chances are that person was putting information, maybe a microfilm in a hollow rock and putting it under a bridge as he walked through. And you would have to plan literally for months how it was that you were going to go and retrieve that rock without Russian security finding you on the street. More sophisticated times, you'd be giving people spy gear. You'd be giving them radios. You'd be giving them, a little later on, satellite communications. But these weren't things that you would find in the local version of Radio Shack. This was spy gear. Anybody who was caught with it was in deep, deep trouble. And they could get caught for all the wrong reasons, having nothing to do with the local security service. They could just have a problem with somebody in their family stumbling over something. It's happened. But what if you can communicate securely in a way that will not identify the sender and the true recipient? And it looks like the kind of communication that everybody else is doing. Wouldn't that be terrific? Well, guess what? In a fundamental sense, we're all becoming spies. We're all communicating out there in the ether. We're all concerned, many of us, and if we're not, we ought to be, about what the wider world can see. What can people know about us in the context of our communications and our relationships that we don't really want them to know, things that we really would like to protect? We all have something to hide, don't we? And in a business context, well, people are encrypting information all the time. People who are involved in international business nowadays, they have intellectual property that they have to protect. They have business secrets that they legitimately have to protect. And so this creates a profile out there into which other people who are sending information securely, secretly, for espionage purposes, can mimic. Maybe not as easy as that. It's not easy at all, because again, you still have to protect where the information is coming from and where ultimately it's going to. But there are tremendous possibilities that we have in the context of the digital age that we never had before. You think about electronic media, digital media. As I was coming up on the train today, I was rummaging around in my briefcase, and I found this. I don't even know what's on it. Maybe I should be more careful. Little thing like this. Holds 2 gigabytes of information. That is just unbelievable. Now, mind you, when I was a tender young officer, I literally had people bringing documents to me that they would secrete in their shirts, right? I remember one guy in particular, and because he couldn't bring a briefcase, he worked in a very sensitive, secure facility. You had to come in and out with your hands clean. That was it. You weren't subject to search, but it was expected. It was a protocol. You didn't bring things in and out. So he would put documents under his shirt, and he would walk rather stiffly out the door until he could come and see me. Well, this same individual, given one of these things, could carry the number of documents that you could carry in a 2.5 truck. It's absolutely unbelievable. It's a huge problem in a counterintelligence context. Now, I don't want to say anything against Private Manning. He's innocent until proven guilty, but he's the individual who, it would appear, may have provided thousands of diplomatic cables and military communications to WikiLeaks. How do you do it? You know, WikiLeaks, they're known for being able to hack into computer systems. They didn't hack into any computer system. This guy, if in fact he did as is alleged, put it on a thing like this and just carried it on out and handed it over to these folks. One of the things that I advise people who in private industry who are trying to protect their secrets, and as their protections, as their methods of protecting themselves and their systems from cyber attacks become more sophisticated, what I keep trying to remind them is that the real danger is the danger within, the danger from your people. What the wrongly motivated person can do if they have administrative access to your system. The flip side of that are the opportunities that belong to the people who are on offense, people that I used to be associated with. So there are tremendous opportunities that are associated with life in the digital age, as well as the tremendous challenges that we just talked about. So, I think we've covered spies and lies, at least quarter-inch deep, half a mile wide. But sneaky guys. Now, you may think that that's just sort of a logical extension of what we've just been talking about. Well, I don't know, and I never asked Ralph to define this for me, but sneaky guys to me those are the dirty trick guys, or what we call in the intelligence world covert action. You see, traditionally, the way intelligence and policy works, it's a linear progression. You collect the information, you sort it, and you analyze it, and you disseminate the information to policymakers, and then hopefully, if your information is good and they're wise enough to heed it, they come up with good policies. It's a linear process. But anymore, so many of the questions that face our country, we already know what the policy is. We're concerned about terrorism. We know what our policy is. We're against it. Nuclear proliferation, proliferation of missile technology. Narcotics. We know what our policy is. And so it's not enough just to report on what's happening. In those contexts, it is the duty and the responsibility of intelligence writ wide, and particularly the clandestine service, to do something about it. We're all afraid of the next major terrorist attack. Well, if we put a report on the president's desk that says, yep, major terrorist attack on this block, New York City, tomorrow, home run. Did really good. We informed the president in advance. This is what's going to happen. No. No, that is not a good job. If we report to the president that Iran is going to have a nuclear bomb 2 weeks from today, last screw goes in, is that a success? Maybe not. So what I would suggest is that the sneaky guys, the real sneaky guys, the people who do covert action, in fact, as we move forward, are going to become more and not less important. That's going to be part of espionage in the digital age as well. Spies, lies, sneaky guys. I think we've covered the waterfront to a certain extent. Now I'd welcome your questions.
Okay. Bob, come on over. We can take some questions. Let me ask one that comes out of your remarks, which is, are we seeing the blending of the signals intelligence world that we all heard about last week from General Hayden and the human intelligence world that you've just been talking about, in the sense that, as I think you were suggesting, human intelligence really can't operate anymore outside the electronic or the digital world? They're just things you no longer can do without intersecting with the electronics that can be picked up by somebody else. Are we going to see the blending of those two forms? Or is human intelligence still something that's always going to be separate?
Well, I think human intelligence is a separate discipline. And separate people do it, and they do it with a separate set of methodologies. But in terms of the way that it's employed, absolutely it's blended with signals intelligence as very broadly defined. So, you know, and when you see all of this come together, and that's one of the marvels in the way that the intelligence community has evolved just in the last 10 years or so, is that now we can combine in real time not only information that comes from human agents with information that we're getting in real time from intercepts, but we're also able to use information that we get in real time from intercepts to guide personnel on the ground. And just a few years ago, that was absolutely unimaginable. So I'm not sure if that's getting
So
at
the sneaky
what
guys are being guided by the signals intelligence in ways that previously was not possible.
Absolutely. And a lot of it just simply had to do with the way that we are able to communicate globally. And again, I don't want to get too far into the tradecraft and the capabilities here, but one of the things that we discovered we were able to do just a number of years ago is, see, you don't always have the linguist that you want who is awake and in the right part of the world at the time when you need him or her. And with improvements in internal communications in the intelligence community, now we've got a system where you can have a drone in a certain part of the world which is picking up signals intelligence, say RF radio, and is immediately in real time sharing that with an analyst who is half a world away, who is interpreting that in real time and then sending the text back so that the people on the ground have it within 10 minutes and just getting it on a live feed. And that's simply a matter of coordination of communications. And with the system that we have right now, we can do it.
We'll come back to that in a minute, but as I mentioned, we're webcast on Second Life, and we have a couple of questions from there, one of them from the Pacific Northwest, and who was asking about, and I thought of this as you were saying it, you were saying you could go to a hotel clerk and it would be impossible for you today to be someone that you're not. Are you telling us that the CIA is incapable of creating a database of credit card transactions that go back more than 6 months on the credit card that you use at the hotel clerk? You couldn't create an identity electronically today that would make that kind of operation succeed?
In fact, I think you could. It would be very difficult. It would be very time-consuming. The chances for making a telltale error would be considerable. And one of the things that people say about, I don't say that we can't do it, and that God knows we may be doing it as we speak. As I say, they don't talk to me anymore, and they shouldn't. But one of the things that folks often fail to appreciate, understandably, is that we're not doing intelligence for the United States as a one-off. This is a global system. We have dozens, in fact hundreds, of intelligence operations that are underway in different parts of the globe simultaneously. And you have to have a system that's capable of doing that. We don't have the luxury of doing intelligence on a retail basis. Now, in certain circumstances, if the priority is high enough, yeah, you'll pull out all the stops and you'll use tremendous resources just to do one operation. But the paradigm for us is global operations. And to do what you're describing on a wholesale basis, as opposed to a retail basis, I think is probably beyond the capabilities of anybody with a reasonable level of resources.
So was your message, in effect, that the kind of spying you used to do where you adopted a different persona, a different identity, a different business from one month to the next is no longer possible?
I'm saying that it is no longer sustainable in the way that it once was. Is it possible? Are they still doing it now? They might very well be. And again, it all depends on what the objective is. If it's a matter of getting across a border, doing a discrete thing, getting out again very, very rapidly, so that if events take their normal course, you'll be long gone by the time anybody figures out that, hey, wait a minute, there's something dodgy about this individual, that's fine. And that probably happens all the time. But if you're talking about a sustained relationship, either with somebody whom you are developing as a potential intelligence source, or somebody who is a current intelligence source, somebody, say, who's going to be going back and forth across the border multiple times, you'd better be who you say you are.
And just to pick up on something you mentioned very early in your remarks, but you just kind of glossed over it, you said not to talk about or not to mention biometrics and other similar kinds of technologies. Are those things widely enough in use in the world today for someone like you to be conscious of them when you walk up to a hotel desk and think they might actually use biometrics on you to see if you really are the person you claim to be?
The short answer is yes, and to what extent it's being used in hotels, I'm not entirely sure, but there are many countries, including some that are not normally considered to be all that sophisticated, particularly in the Middle East, who have access to a lot of money and who are installing these systems. And they're very, very sophisticated. So, yeah, it's more bad news.
For the espionage in the digital age.
That's right.
Covert action in the digital age. Okay, let's take some of your questions. We'll take questions from students and non-students. Let's go with a question from a non-student first tonight. Yes, way back there.
Have you ever studied what compels a person to lie and cheat against his government? And in that study, have you ever determined what you have to do to keep playing to that reason why he's now decided to go against the government or something?
Okay, the question is, have you ever studied, or can you talk to us about what are the motivations for someone to lie and cheat against their own government? And I'm going to make sure that the question includes both lie and cheat against the U.S. government as well as lie and cheat against some other government. Are those motivations different? And how do you play to those when you direct a covert operation?
Well, I think that the reasons why people, well, to answer your question directly, have we ever studied this? Yes, absolutely. And there are a lot of psychologists and psychiatrists who work for CIA and for other elements of the intelligence community who look at this a lot. But honestly, the range of motivations for people to engage in espionage, whether it's against foreign governments or our own, is as broad as human psychology. And I know from personal experience that there are any number of reasons why people do it. And there are times when they do it for the best reasons. There are times when individuals provide information to the United States because they feel that their government's policies are wrong, that they're doing things, supporting terrorism, for instance, that they ought not to be doing, and that the only way of putting a stop to this is by providing information to a country that can actually do something about it. So you might not have the justification to provide this information to Costa Rica, but you may very well have the justification to provide this information to the United States. And frankly, it's one of the comparative advantages I think that CIA has over other intelligence services. But mind you, obviously there are many, many instances where people's motivations are a good deal less noble. It is routine that normally their motivations are a combination of things that we would see as being positive, at least in a narrow context, and things that are clearly venal and negative. And one of the things that you try to do when you're dealing with an individual and you're trying to persuade that individual to betray his or her organization, government, what have you, is to help them to construct the high-minded rationale for doing what it is that they really want to do, perhaps for venal reasons. Does that help at all?
And the questioner asks how you play to those, and in fact, the U.S. government and other governments do that all the time. I mean, when you're trying to turn an agent or an officer of another country to assist the United States, you're precisely playing to those character flaws or that psychology, aren't you?
Oh, absolutely, and often it works on multiple levels. So, I may be speaking to an individual whom I've gotten to know very well over time and have developed a relationship of trust with. And I may end up saying to this individual, it's not fair. The way you've been treated is simply not fair. I've heard all the stories, and I'm just here to tell you that this is simply not fair. These people have never recognized you for who and what you are. They don't recognize the contribution that you make. The country would benefit a great deal if only they would listen to you. And maybe the best way of doing that is to provide the information to allow someone else to take the action that you yourself are unable to take. And by the way, their failure to recognize your contribution has kept you unfairly from being promoted. It's kept you from educating your children in the way they ought to be educated. I know how devoted you are to your children. I know how much their education means to you. Let me help you.
Would you characterize that as sneaky guys?
How am I doing?
A question from a student. Is there a question from a student? Yes, sir.
I realize that
Okay, questioner says, spying's probably not as romantic as James Bond, although, I don't know, you might dispute that a little bit. But have you ever been in a situation where you've been in combat with another agent or found yourself in conflict with someone who's doing exactly the same work you're doing for another country?
Talking about James Bond reminds me of a quote from Winston Churchill, which is that there's nothing in life so exhilarating as being shot at without effect. And, and James Bond has been shot at a lot without effect. No, you're right. Espionage is not quite like James Bond. And no, I don't think I've ever been shot. There was a time somebody might have taken a pot shot at my convoy in Iraq, but I'm not sure that really qualifies. Once had a rocket fired right over my office when I was in Islamabad. So I guess that could have been a close call. The person who fired the rocket fired it out of the back window of a vehicle and just hadn't quite predicted the degree of deflection from the recoil on the rocket, fortunately. But no, I don't think that that's particularly routine. If you're talking about me personally, no, I'm not one of these shoot and scoot guys. But obviously in the war zones, we've had a lot. I think it's intelligence officers. We've had a lot of intelligence officers who, along with their military colleagues, have definitely found themselves under fire in Afghanistan and Iraq in particular. And we've had a lot of armored vehicles shot out. We've lost a number of people, but probably not. We've probably been very fortunate that our losses have been as light as they have under the circumstances.
Setting aside for the moment the question of whether you were ever shot at or whether there was a violent exchange, surely there must have been times in your career when you're crossing a border, when you're going through a checkpoint, when you're being searched or questioned, when you're trying to get into Afghanistan as somebody other than who you are, when you've had that nagging thought in the back of your head that says, oh, something's going wrong here, I forgot to dye my hair, or I forgot to do whatever it was that you forgot to do. Was there something like that?
My mustache is sagging on the side. It happens, believe me. No, I guess with getting at the whole danger thing, and maybe this is a 30-degree deflection from your question, Ralph. There certainly are lots of those of us who serve in dodgy countries with dodgy security. Obviously, have to take tremendous precautions. When I was the chief of station in Islamabad after 9/11, it occurred to me that there may be some people who would take a dim view of me and what I was doing. And so, yeah, we were taking extraordinary precautions to try to make sure that we wouldn't make it easy for people, at least to target me and my colleagues. I was telling the students a little bit before now, and this may come as a surprise, probably, for my money, the most dangerous place I ever served, at least the time that I was serving there, was in Athens in the mid-1980s. People were being killed left, right, and center. I mean, there were terrorists. It was actually a good thing for me. There were lots of people who the Greek government ought not to have allowed to travel into the country, who they were allowing into the country. Many of whom were people I wanted to meet. So this works both ways, and so this is not altogether a bad thing. But you had Palestinians killing Palestinians, Israelis killing Palestinians. You had the November 17 terrorist group, which is an indigenous domestic Greek terrorist group that was targeting Americans and British in particular. Very shortly after I left Athens, the naval attaché, U.S. naval attaché, was killed in an ambush by November 17. So during that period, I never allowed anybody to know where I lived. I was doing a surveillance detection route. I would never allow anybody to follow me where I was going. I wouldn't allow the same car to make two turns with me just before I went into my house. So those are the kinds of precautions that we were taking in those days because people were literally being hunted in the streets.
Question from a non-student. Yes, sir.
I don't think, if you just say a few words on, I want to say a Freudian slip that you may have said, but some of you may have made.
Oh dear, I hate when that happens.
You said espionage was the second oldest profession. And I think you meant what you said.
I did actually.
One big part of it, and one of the students brought up about romanticism. We always look at the men as the spies. And I know you're not going to be able to give us numbers out of the CIA, and pillow talk still exists.
Is your question to give us some guidance on the number of women involved?
Can you tell us about how romanticism on the second oldest, well, the first oldest president, goes into human intelligence? How does that play?
Okay, so maybe let's broaden the question to what's the role of prostitution in espionage, but maybe also you can talk a little bit about, from your knowledge of the clandestine service, is it true that most of the employees there are men, or is there a broader distribution, or what?
Yeah, well, I mean, frankly, what you're describing was a standard ploy of the Soviets for years. You know, the old honeypot, and this is sort of a standard procedure that they would often try to employ, was to entrap people in sexually compromising situations, thinking that would then coerce them. They could use that as a means of coercion to get people to cooperate. Lots of stories surrounding that, and not just involving intelligence people. But on the broader question, what I can tell you is that in CIA, again, the paradigm has changed tremendously. When I was a junior officer, when I went through training, we had very few female candidate officers in my class. It was a very small proportion. Years later, when I was the chief of training, it was fully 50% between the two. And so, yeah, that is a good thing, given who we are as a people, wanting to take take maximum advantage of the talent that we have in our country. On the other hand, in many parts of the world, it's still a man's world. And it is an added burden on women. And I think female case officers, in order to be successful, in some respects have to be, I think, that much better than their male colleagues in many instances, because they are often dealing with men in a setting where their attentions can easily be misconstrued. And so it takes a certain strength of character and a presence to maintain a professional relationship and to make sure that you go down the path that you want and not down the path that perhaps this individual thinks you've been intending all along. So that's an added, it's a reality, and it's something that women have to deal with. In fact, the women who enter CIA do that extremely well. And what we found is that women have been every bit as successful, if not more so, than men, since we've opened up the aperture and we've recruited much larger numbers of women, and a much higher proportion of women into the clandestine service.
You mentioned the Soviets when you were talking about the prostitution aspect of espionage. One of our questioners on Second Life was asking whether you think that the Soviets, the Russians today, are still planting sleeper agents around the world, including in the United States. And does the U.S. engage in that kind of activity, planting officers elsewhere for a very, very long period of time?
I think it's fair to say that and again, this is where you get into cultural differences. The Soviets back in the day were much more inclined to ask people, their officers, to make what we would regard as a tremendous sacrifice of their careers, to take somebody who is otherwise very capable and who might, in a different line, have had a very successful career, and ask them to go be a sleeper agent, to go sit in Duluth or something against the day when there might be a nuclear exchange, so they could do some discrete thing, whatever that was, knowing that if war never came, that basically your career was a waste. They were willing to do that. I'm sure there's a lot that I don't know about things that, operations that were run by the CIA back in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, but I can tell you that culturally we would be far less inclined to do that, to ask somebody to basically take a 99% chance of simply throwing their careers away against the day that they might be able to do some discrete thing under unlikely circumstances. I don't know, does that answer your question?
Question from a student. Yes, right back here.
Do you view the assassination of Osama bin Laden to be an act of sneaky guys, or do you view it more as a military operation? And if you view it as an act of spies or sneaky guys, do you see this as the beginning of a trend or a one-off action, that kind of unilateral action that the United States took?
Okay. Questions about bin Laden's assassination and whether you see it as in the category of covert operations, sneaky guys, as a one-off operation, or whether this is a change of schema and that we're going to see much more of this kind of activity on the part of covert agents in the future.
Yeah, with regard to the first part of your question, is this an intelligence operation, properly so called, or is this a military operation? Frankly, it's a combination of the two. It's a hybrid. And that's true not only in the sense that it was the intelligence community and maybe disproportionately the CIA that had to put together the intelligence package that enabled this operation to happen. Obviously, the actual operation, the shooters on the ground were military. And normally you would prefer it that way because they're professional soldiers. That's what they do. However, it was pretty clear from what was said at the time, if you could read between the lines and understand what was being said, that those JSOC operators, Joint Special Operations Command personnel, were actually operating during the time that they were in Pakistan under CIA authorities. It was mentioned several times, well, this is actually Leon Panetta's operation. And it's because, in fact, those military personnel, when they were engaged in that operation within a country with whom we were not engaged in combat, were essentially chopped over. They were essentially CIA personnel for that brief period in time because the CIA has those authorities and the military does not. And that really gets to the differing authorities under, I don't think we want to get down to the weeds between Title 50 and Title 10, but U.S. military forces are only authorized to operate in combat zones. Pakistan, not an official combat zone. We're not at war with Pakistan. With regard to the broader question about is this sort of a template for the future, the only instances where we are going to be inclined to do this are in areas that we might refer to as ungoverned space. If we know that there's a terrorist in Belgium, well, we're not going to send in either the CIA or the military to do something about it. We're going to tell the Belgian authorities. And that's probably going to be true of a number of countries who may not have very good relations with us, but who don't particularly like terrorists operating on their territory, particularly if they're going to commit acts within their borders. So it's really only in countries that really are not under the control of any organized or responsible political authority, places like large parts of Yemen, Somalia, areas along the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. Those are the only places where we're likely to see that, and frankly, I don't expect to see a great deal of it, not operations like that particularly.
That good question and your answer leads me to ask about a situation that's very much in the news today. Pakistan and the United States are at odds and have been for quite a few months now over whether the kinds of operations that you were just talking about should be being conducted in Pakistan by the United States. And you didn't mention it in your answer here. You were talking about the on-the-ground operation to get Osama bin Laden, but the Pakistanis also complain about other kinds of military or CIA operations, such as the flight of drones over Pakistan, unmanned aircraft. The question for you is, have we blurred the lines with the increasing use of intelligence to conduct what were previously military operations? Have we blurred the lines of the legalities that you were mentioning? And what implication does that have for diplomatic relations and political relations between countries like Pakistan and the United States?
Mm-hmm. I frequently get asked about drones, and I wish that I could answer those questions in French. And the reason for that is not because I'm hoping that people will not understand French. It's because when you're speaking in French, when you're using the subjunctive mood, it's much more obvious. So let me preface that question by saying that I see news reports which indicate that there are individuals who disappear mysteriously in a puff of smoke in places like North Waziristan and Pakistan. And it is supposed by some that these may be the result of missile strikes from drones, which the U.S., of course, never acknowledges. And if they are right, then I would say the following. So just keep that in mind, okay? So anything I say, it's only after that preamble. the question with Pakistan is an extremely complicated one. And there are times when the Pakistanis are just as happy, thank you very much, to see people disappear in a puff of smoke. And there are a lot of militants in the tribal areas, and some of them are primarily of concern to them because they're making war against Pakistan. Some of them they don't think are particularly their problem because they're operating across the line in Afghanistan, and they've got enough enemies, thank you very much, and they just as soon not deal with all of that. At the same time, if these drone strikes are taking place in too frequently and in areas that are politically sensitive, and if there are a significant number of collateral casualties as a result, that makes huge political problems for the Pakistanis. And obviously they would, so they would, I think the long and the short of it is they would like to have control over all this, and obviously they don't. And the reason for it is because these are areas of Pakistan that they simply cannot control. And we have concerns about terrorists based in those areas who are operating internationally. We have concerns about force protection for our own forces in Afghanistan who are under daily attack from people who are operating across the border in Pakistan. And we simply cannot sit on our hands and allow these things to take place. So is it blurring lines to an extent? It is. The fact that we allegedly have these quasi-military operations that are being undertaken by intelligence, but again, the reason for it is the one that I just cited before in the context of the bin Laden raid, and that really has to do with legal authorities. Which entities in the U.S. government have the legal authorities to take this action, which we deem to be necessary in our interest.
As someone who was in charge of the counterterrorism operation in the United States, do you draw a distinction between the incident you mentioned in your remarks earlier, where a drone would be, or earlier in the Q&A, where you said a drone would be sending back a signal from someplace for translation, perhaps in the United States, and then the translation would get sent back to where it's needed. Is there a distinction between that kind of drone operation and the kind of drone operation in which it isn't a signal that's being sent, but it's a missile that's being sent?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And I mean, if in the former case, when we have a drone that's flying for a reconnaissance mission, either to collect signals from the ground, pick up cell phones, radios, whatever, and possibly take overhead photography as well. That's an intelligence gathering operation, and it requires no unusual authorities from the U.S. government for us to do that. That is within the purview of the CIA. Anytime the CIA is asked to essentially to do anything to affect conditions on the ground, whether it's influencing an election or trying to strike in a quasi-military role against terrorists in a particular location, that requires very separate authorities under what is called a presidential finding. It can only be done with the specific authorization, blanket authorization, not case-by-case authorization, but blanket authorization from the president. So is that what you were getting at?
Yeah, that was what I was getting at. I'm going to resist the temptation, because I know there's a lot of other questions, but I'm going to resist the temptation to ask you about whether you would have applied the same French subjunctive preface to the photographs taken of a U.S. drone in Iran when they presented it on the ground in Iran. But I won't ask you about that. A question from a non-student now. We're up to a non-student. Let's see. I want to get places I haven't gone before. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. I'm interested in the fact that the radar screen, metaphorically speaking, is growing larger and larger in terms of the amount of data that's coming in, and how, you can say on top of that, and isn't that one of the reasons that the underwear bomber got on a plane on Christmas Day, even though his father had reported his activities and shared his suspicions about his son?
Okay, questions basically about information overload. In the digital age, can you and the U.S. intelligence agencies handle the flood of information, some of which useful, some of which isn't? Questioner made reference to the underwear bomber whose father had reported something and it just didn't get caught.
Yeah, the problem that you cite is a very real one. It's a serious one, and it's sort of axiomatic now in the intelligence community that often the problem is not enough information; it's too much information, and trying to make sense of that information, which is sometimes gathered literally in terabytes, which they measure in terms of the amount of documentation that could be held in a football stadium. I mean, it's huge, almost unimaginably huge amounts of data, and trying to sift through that and make sense of it and get out the nuggets that may actually have some significance. And I might mention parenthetically that that's not just an intelligence problem. It's also, in some respects, you have to admit, it's sort of a political problem, because one of the pressures that the people who are trying to make sense of those huge amounts of data are operating under is the fact that, God forbid, there is some critical nugget of information that's in there and that they miss it. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at, because then they're going to be blamed after the fact. And that's kind of what you're getting at in the case of the underwear bomber. In that case, though, I don't believe, based on what I heard at the time and from some briefings that I've been privy to, that this was a case of data that was sort of lost in that big stream out there, which had we only received it and recognized it in time, that we might have been able to do something about it. This was really a case of, frankly, human judgment. Somebody had to make a judgment as to whether or not it was critically important that this individual's father had these concerns. I'm a father. I've so lots of concerns. Some of them are well-founded, some of them not. So should extraordinary attention have been paid to this young man? Well, in retrospect, we can say yes. But what I can tell you is that in those terrorist threat databases, there are literally hundreds of thousands of names. And at any given time, analysts have to make decisions as to which of those particular individuals at a given point in time we are going to devote particular scrutiny to, where we're going to put them on the priority list. And I think that was a case where there was what we now know was a human mistake. Would reasonable individuals necessarily have made a different choice given what people knew at the time? That may be a bit of a toss-up, and nobody would want to admit that, and maybe I'm being too forgiving of the intelligence community, but I'm not really sure what the answer to that question would be.
Bob, here's a question from two different web viewers, one in Orlando, one in Upper New York State. Same question, essentially. One of the keys of the digital age is the idea of crowdsourcing or it's called citizen journalism sometimes. In this case, they're referring to it as citizen intelligence. Do you see that trend, that possibility of crowdsourced information coming from perhaps other countries as being something that's useful to the U.S. or perhaps challenging to U.S. intelligence?
Well, I would place that category of information in the broad category of open source information. And there's been an explosion in clandestinely acquired information. There's been a much larger explosion in open source information. And that is becoming proportionally a much more important slice of the overall intelligence picture. And one of the challenges for the intelligence community is to appropriately leverage information which we don't have to collect secretly, clandestinely. And things that we can get openly, we ought to get openly. We ought to devote our scarce resources, to go after those things in the clandestine world that can only be acquired that way. So my answer is yes, I think that this is potentially a very significant stream of information, will become more significant over time, both as it comes to the intelligence community directly and as it comes mediated through newspapers and others who make use of this sort of popularly generated information. But and I don't think that the intelligence community should see this in any way as being competition. It's a blessing, actually, if we have the analytic means to actually employ it usefully. And let's just devote those resources that we can devote to clandestine collection in those areas where we absolutely need it, and let the other stuff take care of itself.
Question from a student next, from a student. Where are we? Yes, all the way in the back.
Speaking of sneaky guys in a digital age, I'm sure you're familiar with the Stuxnet worm that attacked Iranian heavy element enrichment facilities, and also with your experience in the Middle East. What's your opinion of interaction between the CIA and Mossad, the Israeli Secret Service?
The question was, repeat the very last sentence.
Just in your experience, what's your experience of interaction between Mossad and CIA?
So the questioner prefaced by referring to the Stuxnet virus, which actually we talked about last week, that was something that damaged the Iranian nuclear development program. But the question actually that was asked was, what is the relationship between U.S. intelligence and the Israeli intelligence service, Mossad?
With regard to Stuxnet, there's really not a whole lot I think that I can add to that. Perhaps it is what they say it is, and who is behind it, I certainly don't know. In the broad context of U.S. relations between CIA and the Mossad, obviously there are such relations. Mossad I think is very capable in the areas that it focuses on. I think it's a very capable espionage service. I have doubt sometimes about their analytic capabilities, but I think they're a very good espionage service. They're tough guys. They're very focused guys. I've fought with them on many occasions. But with regard to whether, I think maybe you didn't ask the question, but I think maybe what you're maybe suggesting, might this Stuxnet have been a product of cooperation between the CIA and the Mossad? All I can say is the truth, which is I don't know.
Okay. Question from a non-student? Yes, sir.
I think as Americans, we've always had kind of a sense of security that no matter how crazy the world is getting, our technology and everything is always a little step above, our drones or our stealth technology. But going back to some of the things you opened with about, the increase in electronic availability of data and how many times, Chinese have been trying to hack into our national labs, do you have any sense of, are we still that far ahead, or has DARPA got some things they're developing where we have no idea about that, or so sophisticated, or is that window actually closing, and that gap of sophistication that we've enjoyed getting smaller and smaller as the world is changing?
Okay, questioner's asking, prefacing by saying he believes the U.S. has always been a step ahead in terms of technology and intelligence. Do you think that's still the case? And I'll broaden it to ask whether, depending on your answer, what effect does that have on the need for clandestine services? If the technology gap is narrowing, what does that do for the need for clandestine services?
It's a very, very broad question. And if you talk about relative technical sophistication and whether we have a critical advantage over others, that very much depends on the context within which you're speaking, and so there's a whole broad realm of the commercial world, which encompasses most of technology, and others more competent than me would have to address where we stand. I think relative to other nations, but clearly, I mean, the technical expertise is something which recognizes no borders. And there are tremendous pockets of technical expertise that are in foreign countries, and that comes here, and ours goes there. So, but insofar as technology is employed in military and intelligence operations, as a practical matter, clearly we have a fairly significant advantage, particularly over the people who are our current and most likely adversaries. That's a gap that I think is going to narrow over time. I think that's just inevitable. So much of what we do in the government realm necessarily leverages capability that's not developed at DARPA or strictly within the government, but which is actually being developed in the wider commercial world and then adapted for intelligence and military uses. So for all those reasons, we're going to see that gap narrow. What helps to keep the U.S. in a relatively preponderant position in military intelligence is simply because the amount of resources that we are devoting to it, which of course puts us head and shoulders above everybody else. With regard to this question you posed, Ralph, which I think is an extremely important one, and that is, given the the sophistication of technology now and the technologies that are being put to intelligence collection, intelligence analysis, what does that really do to the relative position of espionage? And I guess what I would say is that espionage remains tremendously important because at the end of the day, it's people who make decisions. At the end of the day, whatever technical protections you put in place, there's probably a person someplace who can help you to defeat it. You may have tremendous protections in place that will keep anybody from successfully launching an internet-based strike against your computers and your information systems, and yet there's that one individual inside the organization who is in the right place, who can compromise the whole thing. That's an intelligence target. So I don't see espionage becoming any less important over time. I just think the context in which it takes place and the targets against which it is directed will change and evolve as the world does.
I got to ask you a lighter note question for a second. The more I listen to you talk, the more disappointed I become as I come to realize that I don't think you ever had a pen that you could push a button and it would turn into a laser-guided missile. And I'll bet you never drove a car that had a smoke screen in the back of it, and you know, and I'll bet you never met any of those girls in Goldfinger either. I mean, this is a tremendous disappointment to me.
You know,
Can't you tell me I'm wrong?
Now, I wish I could tell you that you were wrong. And I did send out those requisitions.
But somehow they never got answered?
And they kept getting lost. And as for the girls, well, I wouldn't even know.
We don't want to go there, huh? Okay.
No, won't go there.
All right. We're up to a question from a student. Question from a student? No? Yes.
How did you make the transition from the University of Virginia, I believe, graduate student to
Okay, good question for the students in the audience. How do you what's the transition you made from undergraduate and graduate world to the CIA?
Yeah, I was telling students earlier today that I wish I had an inspiring story for them, about how I'd always had this desire to go off and serve my country in the intelligence service, and finally I had the chance.
Or you were recruited in the shadows
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Or I was recruited, at Dartmouth College, and one of the deans, came up to me one day and said, "Young man," no, it's nothing like that. I stumbled into it, is what it was. I was looking for a job somewhere in the foreign affairs realm because I was studying it in graduate school, and I didn't have any particular preferences. I thought, that maybe I'd go into the diplomatic service. I sort of wandered in and applied to be an analyst at the CIA, and the next thing I knew, I was in a completely different branch of the CIA, and life took its course. The next thing I knew was 27 years later. So I just sort of wandered into it. So as I said, I wasn't smart enough to really plan my future, but I was smart enough to recognize a good opportunity when I stumbled over it.
Would you do it again if you had to do it again?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Honestly, the 27 years I spent in CIA, I really never had a bad day. I had a lot of bad things happen to me. But there's a seduction in the work. It's the only word that I can use to describe it. There's just something that just grips you about it. And I couldn't believe people were paying me to do this. I really couldn't. That said, when it was time for me to leave, I felt it was time for me to leave. I've done all the things that I really wanted to do. Didn't have any regrets. Wasn't hoping that I'd be called back someday. And I'm glad that I've had the opportunity to do a lot of the other things that you just don't have the opportunity to do in that kind of a restricted life. And life in the CIA is very restricted in certain respects, as you can well imagine. But one thing I did want to mention, I wanted to mention to the students, and having failed to do that, I'd like to mention it now, and that's some guidance for young people who want to get into CIA, who want a life in intelligence. And once again, this is life in the digital age. If they want to apply, they have to apply online. And so God knows how many applications go in, and they just go into the system. And frankly, it's like dropping something into a black hole in many respects. And so it's really, really important to network. It really is. That it makes a huge difference if there is somebody, not to go and necessarily advocate on your behalf, but just to make sure that you get considered after your application goes into this huge electronic maw. And I have students who come to me all the time and asking for guidance, and I try to give them as much time as I can. And there have been many instances where I've sent their names and their resumes forward. Not to say that I knew these people, that I could necessarily vouch for them, but it seems like a good person, take a look. And I have full assurances that at least somebody is going to take a good look at that application and make a determination as to whether they should go to the next step. So I would strongly encourage people to do that.
Question from a non-student. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
As a follow-up to the question about the Mossad, Iran is such a closed society. I was curious to what extent, perhaps hypothetically, to what extent you would see the CIA playing a role affecting conditions on the ground relative to the requirement of nuclear capability.
Okay, questioner is asking about Iran. To what extent would you imagine the U.S. intelligence service playing a role in trying to do something about Iran's development of a nuclear weapon?
Yeah, I would agree that Iran is a very difficult, challenging environment within which to operate, in large part because it's not a very welcoming place, certainly for official Americans. There's no official American presence there, and we saw what happened, for instance, to a couple of hikers, simple hikers, who were, 3 of them who were wandering along the border there in Kurdistan and ended up being guests of the Iranian state for many months. So yes, it's a very difficult place to operate in. As far as the role that U.S. intelligence may be playing in trying to keep the Iranians from acquiring a nuclear weapon, I have no idea, and I couldn't say anything if I did. So.
Did you ever have a moment in your career, as the author of the ethics documents for the trainees back at the farm, was there ever a moment in your life, in your career, when you sat down and you really it was blurry who the black hats were and who the white hats were?
In that fundamental sense, no, absolutely not. And God knows I have disagreed with aspects of U.S. foreign policy on many occasions and over many years. And so it's not as though I think that my country is infallible by any stretch. But I do believe that that we are well intentioned, and that the U.S. by and large is a force for good in the world, and that this is a responsibility that we've taken on our shoulders, so that even if we'd made nothing but mistakes in the past, even if the CIA was a thoroughly corrupt organization, I would say that it needs to be reinvented and we need to start all over again, because this is the responsibility that we have as a country. So no, I've never, in that fundamental sense, if I thought that maybe we'd wandered off the path, if there are things that I've been engaged in that I've questioned, absolutely. But in that fundamental sense, sort of this, what was it, the spy who came in from the cold, with this conversation between the British spy and the Russian, and they're really not sure who are the good guys, at the end of the day. I've never had any qualms about that whatsoever.
Okay. Question from a student? Is there a question from a student? Yes, ma'am.
Do you feel like the use of drones stifles the understanding of countries to use violence or even to go to war with other countries? So does using drones make countries less powerful?
Okay, question is about drones. Does the use of drones by the United States give other nations an excuse, in effect, to use military action against others? Does it say if the U.S. does it, they can do it?
I'm not aware, there's not a particular instance of that would come to mind. I would say, though, that the use of drones is, again, to borrow the same word, it can be a little bit seductive. I think there's been a lot of controversy, for instance, about this strike against Anwar Awlaki, who is an American citizen, radical Muslim cleric, who left the United States, went to Yemen, and was first preaching propaganda and encouraging people to engage in violence against the United States and against Americans, and then apparently took on an operational role in the context of the underwear bomber, as a matter of fact. and ultimately was struck apparently by a missile from a drone in Yemen. And this is a fairly extraordinary circumstance in virtue of the fact that he was an American citizen. And should that have made a difference? I think the fact that when these operations take place via drones, I think that they're somehow seen as more antiseptic, and people don't have as many moral qualms about them. I think if it were somebody with a pistol on the ground shooting this individual, I think morally it might be an equivalent act, and yet we would look at it very differently, I think, many of us. So yeah, I worry a little bit that this drone war, which sort of enables us to operate literally at 30,000 feet above the ground, where no one can touch us and where we can sort of act with impunity, may cause us not to reflect in as much as perhaps we ought to. At the end of the day, I don't have any moral qualms about what may have happened with Mr. Olaki, but I do see a certain moral hazard there with regard to drones, something that we have to be conscious of.
Without asking you to comment on whether the U.S. has or uses drones, are there other countries that have or use drones in the same way that we've been talking about here tonight? Is there any competition, essentially, at the moment?
Yeah. I often think about, there was this old song that they used to sing in music houses in London back during the Victorian days. And
I didn't think you were that old.
Huh? No, you'd be surprised. People often are. And it went that for in the end we have got the Maxim gun and they have not. So Victorian England, when they were fighting colonial wars, they knew at the end of the day that they had preponderant military technology that these native peoples could never resist, and that at the end of the day, whatever tactical reverses they might suffer, that they were always going to win out because they had the Maxim gun. And sometimes I feel like we're in that position now. We have capabilities that really no one else can respond to. At least in the places where they're being employed, terrorists really can't respond very effectively in kind with drones, whatever purpose they're being put to. So yeah, I think that's a clear qualitative advantage that we have. The only other people that I know, lots of other countries, a number of other countries, obviously, that have the technology to do it if they chose to. The Israelis use drones quite effectively, and primarily in the occupied territories. But they're the only ones that I'm aware of offhand who make active use of drones in an active intelligence collection and paramilitary sense.
Okay. Before we say thanks to Bob Grenier, let me tell you about our next program, if I may. 2 weeks from tonight, 2 weeks, on Wednesday, April 4th, we'll meet a man whose job it is to question, to challenge what the CIA is doing. Eric Anderson is a career intelligence officer who serves on what the CIA calls its red cell. So to be sure you don't miss word about programs like these, if you'd like to get on the list, put your name and your email address clearly on one of those bright orange sheets out in the lobby on their way out this evening. Now, please, let's thank our speaker tonight, Robert Grenier. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming.